Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we're going somewhere truly grim. We're scraping off the pleasant veneer of historical tales and looking at something genuinely awful. We're talking about an ancient Persian execution method so horrific, it sounds less like a way to die and more like a deliberate, agonizing process of unmaking. Trust me, being sentenced to this was nothing like getting a slap on the wrist, unless that slap was administered by a million tiny, hungry mouths. So, before we dive into this one, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, dragging you into history's dark corners. And hey, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and maybe one word that comes to mind when you think about things crawling where they shouldn't. Yeah, we're starting there. Now dim the lights, turn on a fan, and get ready for a journey. Because tonight we're easing into history together, into its strange and sometimes unsettling depths. Specifically, into the dark, confined space of ancient Persia's most infamous torture chamber. Imagine for a moment a sensation, not pain exactly, not yet. Something softer, stickier, it's coating your chin, running down your neck. Sweet, thick, cloying. You can smell it, a sickly sweet perfume mingling with something else. Something already beginning to turn sour in the heat. Milk and honey, a bizarre, almost nurturing substance being forced onto you, into you. But this isn't sustenance, it's preparation. You're bound, flat on your back, unable to move. The wood beneath you is rough, unfinished, digging into your skin. Above, the sky, or maybe just the rough-hewn roof of something small, enclosed. You're in a box, a wooden vessel maybe, but not one for sailing, one for holding. Holding you tightly, this isn't a quick end. History is full of swift, brutal ways to depart this mortal coil, the axe, the noose, the sudden thrust of a spear. They aim for termination. This is different. This aims for a process. A slow, deliberate dissolution of the body, facilitated by natural, inevitable forces that most of us spend our lives instinctively recoiling from. You are trapped, exposed, and coated in an attractant. And you know with a sickening certainty that things are coming. Things that buzz, things that crawl, things that eat. Zooming out for a moment, consider the minds that conceived this. We often think of ancient punishments as brutal but perhaps straightforward. Vengeance, deterrence through public spectacle. But Scaphism, if the ancient accounts are to be believed, suggests a mind focused not just on ending a life, but on maximizing suffering, helplessness, and decay. It's not about a swift blow for breaking a law or defying a king. It's about transforming the condemned into a living, breathing site of putrefaction. It's a punishment that turns the victim into a biological event horizon. What kind of political or moral framework allows for that? What does it say about how a society views the very integrity of the human body, the threshold of pain, or the definition of suffering, when they engineer a death this intimate with decomposition? Think about societies where power was absolute, where defying the authority wasn't just a crime, but often a cosmic or religious offense. In such a world, punishment wasn't just earthly justice. It was often about restoring a perceived order, striking fear deep into the populace, making an example that would be whispered in hushed, terrified tones for generations. Scaphism, described by Greek historians like Herodotus and Plutarch, when speaking of Persian justice, served this purpose chillingly well. It was less an execution and more a public, protracted performance of horror, designed to shatter not just the individual, but the observers. Back in the box, the sun, if you can see it, is starting to beat down. Or maybe it's just the oppressive heat under a simple awning or within the wooden structure. The sweetness of the milk and honey is now mixed with the growing, unavoidable stench of your own waste. Because yes, part of this exquisite design is that you are also force-fed copious amounts to induce diarrhea. You are not just confined, you are marinating in your own filth, a perfect breeding ground, a perfect attractant. The sticky sweetness, the sour waste, it's a potent combination, a biological signal screaming, "Come and get it." Your body, utterly vulnerable, has become the larder. The wood is rough. You try to shift, even a fraction, but the straps hold firm wrists, ankles, neck, all secured. The helplessness is immediate, crushing. You can't swat, you can't turn away, you can't escape the growing stickiness, the heat, the smell. You are reduced to a core of raw sensation, trapped within a shell of wood and your own biological output. You are a package prepared for delivery to the insects. This is where the process truly begins, not with a blade, but with the first faint buzz on the air, the promise of things that creep and crawl, drawn by the feast you have been engineered to provide. And your journey into this specific, personalized hell is just beginning. What you're experiencing is known to history, albeit through accounts filtered through the minds of ancient Greek writers who were often keen to highlight the barbarity of the Persians. They called it Scaphism. The name itself comes from a Greek word, scaph, meaning anything scooped out like a bowl or a boat. And that's exactly what was involved. Not one boat typically, but two, or sometimes two hollowed-out logs. Imagine two halves of a dark, rough wooden shell, just long enough to contain a human body lying supine. You were placed inside one half. Then, the second half was placed on top, or perhaps cinched down over you, enclosing you almost completely. There were strategically placed openings for your head, your hands, your feet. These extremities were left exposed, protruding from the wooden casing. Straps, heavy and unyielding, were used to secure you tightly within this wooden sarcophagus. They pinned you down across your chest, your abdomen, your legs. No wiggling, no turning, no attempt to dislodge yourself. You were fixed, a human specimen mounted for observation, or rather, for consumption. Feel the pressure of the wood against your back, your sides. It's rough, maybe causing splinters if the craftsmanship was poor, but sturdy enough to prevent any significant movement. The straps are cutting into your skin, making your exposed hands and feet tingle with restricted circulation. You can crane your neck, perhaps, see the sky if you're lucky, or just the inside of some rough structure. Your world has shrunk to the dimensions of this double coffin, this cruel, wooden embrace. It feels less like being buried and more like being packaged. A human package, deliberately designed to keep you alive and accessible. Accessible for what? Well, that's where the true horror begins to deepen. Zooming out, let's place this within the historical context where these descriptions originate. These accounts come from Greek historians writing about the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a vast, powerful realm that stretched across continents. While the Greeks were often at odds with the Persians and their accounts might be biased, The sheer detail and unique nature of methods like Scaphism suggest they weren't entirely fabricated. It speaks to a capacity for inventing punishments that were not merely deadly, but spectacularly and protractedly agonizing. Why? Because in an empire of that scale, controlling disparate peoples and maintaining absolute authority required fear. Profound visceral fear. A swift execution is forgotten. A slow, public, nauseating death becomes a legend whispered in hushed tones, a chilling cautionary tale. Think about the mechanics of power. You want to deter rebellion, theft, treason. You could just kill people. Or you could make death something so repellent, so dehumanizing, that the mere thought of it curdles the blood. Scaphism takes the body, the most fundamental aspect of self, and subjects it to the most profound indignities and torments imaginable, while the mind is still active. It's not just about ending a life. It's about breaking a person down on every possible level physically, mentally, biologically. It turns the condemned into a public exhibit of state power, a power so absolute it could dictate not just that you would die, but precisely how your living flesh would be consumed. Back to the boat, you are utterly dependent now on whoever put you here, on the sun or lack thereof, on the creatures that will inevitably find you, and crucially on the continued, twisted care of your captors, because they aren't done with you yet. The binding is only the first step in a process that requires ongoing administration. The enclosure isn't just about restraint, it's about creating a specific, contained environment. An environment perfect for accumulating waste and attracting the next stage of your tormentors. An environment that, once the next step is administered, becomes a breeding ground for decay, with you at its horrific center. And what is that next crucial and utterly sickening step in this process of unmaking? It involves those sweet, sticky substances you first encountered, and ensures your journey through this confined, decaying space continues in the most biologically horrifying way possible. They arrive, whoever they are, guards, executioners, functionaries of the state, and they bring nourishment. But don't mistake this for kindness. They lift your head, tilt it back, and force more of that mixture of milk and honey down your throat. Taste it again, thick, oversweet, almost nauseatingly rich. It coats your tongue, your teeth. Some of it inevitably spills, dribbling down your chin onto your exposed neck and chest, mingling with the sweat and the grime already accumulating. It's a sticky, inescapable film. Swallowing is difficult, maybe because of the position, maybe from fear, but they persist, holding your nose, forcing it down. This isn't a one-time deal. According to the accounts, this feeding was done daily. Or even more frequently, enough to keep you alive, to prolong the process. Think about that, the sheer, deliberate intent not to kill you quickly, but to maintain your biological functions, to keep the engine running while the dismantling begins. They are force-feeding you life, solely for the purpose of experiencing death in the most drawn-out, agonizing way imaginable. It's a perversion of sustenance, turning the act of feeding, something fundamental to life, into a tool of torture. The taste becomes a signal of dread, the act a ritual of your ongoing suffering. It's humiliating, degrading, and utterly beyond your control. Zooming out, this daily administration highlights the truly systematic nature of Scaphism. This wasn't just leaving someone out to die. It required upkeep, manpower. Someone had to mix the milk and honey, someone had to carry it, someone had to physically force it into the victim. It wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. It was a protocol, a horrific bureaucratic process carried out by agents of the state. What did those individuals think? Were they hardened, desensitized, just following orders? The sheer logistics of maintaining this suffering add another layer of grim fascination. It suggests a society, or at least a regime, where the capacity for inflicting pain was not only present, but institutionalized and meticulously managed. And the milk and honey served a dual purpose, one even more ghastly than mere prolongation of life. The copious amounts forced into you day after day, combined with the victim's inability to move or expel waste normally, guaranteed one thing: violent diarrhea. You are not only confined, you are sitting, lying, marinating in your own excrement. The boat, remember, it's scooped out, but it also contains you. There's nowhere for the waste to go. It collects around you, soaking your clothes, your skin, filling the bottom of the wooden shell. The smell is overpowering, a hot, fetid cloud rising around you, mingling with the sweet, cloying scent of the milk and honey. Feel it. The wetness, the warmth, the foulness against your skin. It's not just unpleasant, it's a profound violation of every instinct for cleanliness, for dignity. Your body has become a factory of filth, and you are trapped within its output. This is the ultimate indignity, the stripping away of sanitation, comfort, and self-respect. And it's a calculated move, because this combination of sweet, fermenting liquid, rotting food particles, and human waste is the perfect, irresistible beacon. It creates the ideal environment. It sends out the invitation. This deliberate creation of filth within the confined space is the second, crucial function of the forced feeding. It is the biological trigger. It is the attractant that guarantees the arrival of the next horrifying element of this punishment. You have become a living, breathing, decaying bait station. And the creatures drawn by this potent, sickening aroma are already on their way, promising an entirely new and intensely visceral dimension to your suffering. The milk and honey, a sickening memory on your tongue, is now working its way through you, promising the foul inevitable. The rough wood presses on your back, the straps bite into your limbs, and the smell, the smell is becoming your entire world. It's thick, hot, a terrible stew of oversweetness, and your own rapidly decomposing waste. There's nowhere for it to go. It pools around you, a dark, reeking tide soaking into your clothes, your skin. Every slight shift sends a sickening ripple through the warmth and wetness. This is the waiting room of Scaphism. It's not passive. Every second is amplified by the knowledge of what is designed to happen here. You are exposed. Perhaps directly to the sun, beating down, amplifying the heat within the confined space, quickening the fermentation of the filth. Or maybe under a rudimentary shelter, still hot, still stagnant, but shielded from view, leaving you alone with your mounting horror. The rough wood is chafing, leaving splinters. The constant dampness and filth are starting to irritate your skin, a maddening itch you can't scratch, a growing discomfort that is just the prelude. Feel the helplessness deepen. You can see your hands, maybe, sticking out from the wooden shell. You can see the flies starting to arrive, drawn by the scent. They land on your exposed skin, on your face, buzzing around your head, tasting the sticky residue of milk and honey, the moisture around your eyes, your mouth. They are the scouts, the vanguard of the coming wave. You twitch, try to shake your head, but the straps hold firm. The flies are undisturbed for long. They return, landing, tickling, harassing. Each one is a tiny, buzzing promise of what's to come, a reminder of your utter, profound vulnerability. Zooming out, think about the passage of time in this state. Accounts vary, but victims could reportedly last for days in the boat. Days of conscious torment, days of lying in your own waste, exposed, force-fed, waiting. This wasn't an execution measured in minutes or hours. It was a death measured in cycles of feeding, excretion, and the slow biological processes of decay and consumption. This prolongs the suffering far beyond what seems humanly possible. It's a testament to both the perverse ingenuity of the punishment and the grim resilience of the human body, forced to endure far beyond the point of reason or hope. What does it do to the mind, this enforced, agonizing waiting? You are trapped in a feedback loop of discomfort and dread. The physical sensations, the wetness, the itching, the biting straps, the heat, the smell, are a constant, undeniable reality. But the psychological torture is perhaps worse. Knowing what the filth is for. Knowing the flies are not just annoying, but are drawn by design. Waiting for the first real bite, the first sign that the process of being consumed alive has truly begun. Your thoughts become a frantic, useless whirlwind, or perhaps they narrow to a single, desperate focus. The next sensation, the next buzzing intruder. The sun continues its march, or the light fades, only to return. The temperature might drop, offering a brief, cold misery, only to rise again, amplifying the putrid smells. Your skin, constantly wet and exposed to waste, is becoming raw, inflamed. The flies are bolder now, landing not just to taste, but to linger. You can see them, black specks against the light, congregating. Their numbers are growing. The buzzing is louder now, a constant, irritating hum that surrounds your head, lands on your exposed skin. The anticipation is a heavy cloak. Every landing insect is a jolt of dread. Every persistent buzz is a reminder. You are trapped, stewing in filth, and meticulously prepared as a feast. The waiting is almost over. The biological signal sent by your predicament has been received. The first wave of unwelcome guests has scouted the territory. And the main force, the true agents of this slow, intimate dissolution, are about to descend. Get ready. They're coming, and they are hungry. The waiting is over. The hum you heard earlier, the scattered buzzing of the scouts, is now a roar. A cloud descends, drawn by the potent, sickening cocktail of milk, honey, and human waste that surrounds and coats you. Flies, thousands of them. Gnats, beetles, other things that creep and crawl, alerted to the sudden, unnatural bounty your body has become. They land. On your exposed hands, your feet, your face. They land on your eyelids, the edges of your mouth, crawling into your nostrils. Feel it, not just one or two, but dozens, hundreds, their tiny legs skittering across your skin. They are feasting on the milk and honey residue, on the moisture from your eyes, on the sweat. But that's not the worst part. They are also laying eggs. In the open sores where the straps bite, in the creases of your skin, in the dampness around you, and most horrifyingly, in any open orifice or wound. tiny white specks deposited with chilling efficiency. You can see them maybe if one lands near your eye, or feel the faint, unsettling pressure as they are laid. And then the next stage, the eggs hatch, quickly in the heat, nourished by the feast provided. Maggots, living, wriggling larvae. They are small at first, almost invisible, but they grow, and they feed, not just on the waste, but on living tissue. Your skin, which is already softened and irritated by the constant exposure to filth and dampness, becomes their primary target. Feel that faint tickle that doesn't go away, that constant, unsettling movement under the surface. That is them, beginning their work. The sensation is indescribable. It's not a bite, not a sting, at least not at first. It's a constant, relentless crawling, a squirming movement over and under your skin. They are in the shallow wounds, they are burrowing into the damp, decaying flesh. Your muscles tense, a useless reflex. You want to writhe, to claw at yourself, to rub against the rough wood, anything to dislodge them, to escape the sensation of being consumed from the outside in, and perhaps from the inside out. But you can't. The straps hold you fast. Your hands are twitching, uselessly, just inches from your face, unable to brush away the horrors crawling all over you. Zooming out from the immediate, terrifying sensation, consider the biological efficiency of this. Scaphism turns the human body into a micro-ecosystem of decay. It weaponizes natural processes, fermentation, decomposition, the life cycle of insects. It's a horrific symbiosis, where your living body is the host and the food source for creatures that are usually associated with death and decay after life has ended. This punishment forces you to experience, while conscious, the biological reality of decomposition. It is a profound violation of the natural order, a state-sponsored acceleration of the return to dust, enacted with horrifying precision. Beyond the flies and maggots, other things are drawn to the scene. Ants, perhaps, their sharp bites adding to the symphony of torment. Accounts mention vermin, attracted by the filth and the smell of decay. Rats may be in the darkness, drawn to the edges of the boat. The vulnerability is absolute. There are no defenses left. You are simply available. Available to everything that crawls, buzzes, or scurries, drawn by the irresistible signal your suffering body emits. The pain is building now, not just from the straps or the raw skin. The bites are becoming constant. The maggots are feeding, their digestive enzymes breaking down tissue. It's a burning, itching, tearing sensation that originates from a million tiny points across your body. And the sound, the constant, low hum of insects, the skittering, and maybe, if you listen closely, the faint, horrifying sound of tiny mandibles at work. Your world is reduced to this unbearable symphony of consumption, and the feeling of your own body being slowly, meticulously disassembled by life. This is the core of Scaphism's horror. Not a sudden death, but the forced, intimate experience of being eaten alive, from the outside and potentially from within. The helplessness, the degradation, the sheer biological terror of feeling life feeding on your living flesh. You are no longer just a prisoner, you are a larder. And the process, now that the guests have arrived in force, will only deepen and intensify day after agonizing day as your body breaks down and they continue their feast. The peak of this nightmare is here, and there is no escape. Days bleed into one another. The sun rises and falls, or the oppressive heat remains constant under whatever rudimentary cover shields your torment from public view. The rhythm of your existence is now dictated by the relentless, horrifying activity on and within your body. The flies, those initial messengers of doom, are a constant, buzzing shroud. They swarm your exposed face, drawn to the moisture around your eyes, your mouth, the edges of your nostrils. But the true work, the fundamental dismantling, is being performed by their offspring, the maggots. Born in the filth and the dampness, on and near your flesh. They are growing, fattening themselves on the gruesome bounty. Feel them, the constant, sickening movement under your skin in the raw areas burrowing into the softened tissue. It's a sensation that gnaws at the edges of your sanity, a relentless, internal itching, a feeling of being consumed from a million tiny points simultaneously. Your skin is no longer intact. It's becoming a landscape of raw, inflamed tissue, festering wounds where the straps rub and where the insects have concentrated their efforts. The wetness from your waist is constant, warm and biting, dissolving the outer layers of skin, making it easier for the maggots to feed. The smell is now beyond description. It's no longer just the milk and honey mixed with excrement. It's the sharp, metallic tang of blood, the cloying sweetness of decay, the pungent odor of infected tissue. It's the smell of your own body breaking down, rotting, while you are still alive to witness it, to smell it, to feel the process unfolding from the inside out. It fills your nostrils, coats your tongue, becomes the very air you breathe. There is no escape, no fresh breeze, no way to clear your head of the pervasive, sickening stench of your own putrefaction. Zooming out, the sheer duration of this punishment is what makes it so particularly horrifying. Accounts like those from Plutarch suggest victims could endure this for days, sometimes up to 17 days, before succumbing to a combination of dehydration, starvation, septic shock, and the overwhelming physical and psychological trauma. 17 days, think about that. That's not an execution, that's a biological siege. It highlights a key difference between many ancient punishments and this one, the deliberate engineering of protracted suffering. Other methods might be quick and brutal. Scaphism is slow, intimate, and utilizes the body's own processes and vulnerabilities against it. Why prolong it? This level of sustained cruelty wasn't just about retribution. It was about making an example so terrifying, so viscerally repulsive, that the mere mention of it would prevent any future transgression. It strips away every last shred of dignity, reduces the condemned to a state lower than an animal, a mere vessel for decay and feeding. It tells anyone who witnesses or hears of it, this is what happens when you defy absolute power. Your body, your very being, can be repurposed into something horrific, something that feeds the lowest forms of life, and you will be forced to endure every second of it. It's a message etched in flesh, rot, and the constant buzz of flies. Back in the boat, the pain is a dull, constant throb interspersed with sharp, biting stabs. The itch is a maddening, unceasing torture. Your skin is raw, hypersensitive in some areas, perhaps starting to go numb in others as nerve endings are damaged. You might feel the faint heat generated by the intense biological activity around you, the miniature ecosystem of decay generating its own warmth. The sound of the buzzing is a constant drone, a soundtrack to your undoing. It is punctuated by the quieter, more horrifying sounds, the faint sittering, the wet sounds of feeding. Your body is failing. It's fighting instinctively against the invaders, against the decay, against the sheer indignity of the situation. But it's a losing battle. The process is too advanced, the helplessness absolute. You are becoming less and less you. Less solid, less intact. You are transforming into the very thing you were forced to lie in, a breeding ground of filth and feeding creatures. And while your body is undergoing this horrifying transformation, your mind, however clouded by pain, delirium, and despair, is trapped inside, witnessing every agonizing step of the unmaking. The physical torment is profound, but the psychological horror of this absolute helplessness is perhaps the deepest cut of all. Your body is breaking down, and there is nothing you can do but feel it happen. The line between outside and inside is blurring. Is that buzzing sound real, or is it echoing inside your skull, a phantom symphony of torment? The constant, relentless pain from the bites, the raw skin, the biting straps, it's no longer distinct. It's a dull roar under everything, a baseline of agony that your mind is struggling and failing to process. The heat is oppressive, or perhaps you're shivering despite it, body temperature erratic. The smell is so overwhelming, so deeply ingrained, you wonder if you are the smell now. Delirium is setting in. The world is tilting. Faces might appear in the shifting patterns of light and shadow, grotesque figures formed by the flies buzzing over your eyes. Voices, perhaps distorted whispers that might be the wind or distant guards, or just the sound of your own fraying sanity. You might hallucinate, see things that aren't there, or reinterpret the horrifying reality through a distorted lens. The rough wood of the boat might seem to writhe. The maggots appear as vast, undulating waves. Your sense of time is shattered. Is it day or night? Has it been hours or ages since the last force feeding, since the last wave of tormentors arrived? Feel the profound, soul-crushing helplessness. Every instinct screams at you to fight, to flee, to defend yourself. Your muscles twitch, uselessly straining against the unyielding straps. You try to lift a hand, to brush away a fly, to scratch an unbearable itch, but the effort is futile. Your limbs are prisoners within the wooden shell. This absolute lack of agency, the inability to perform even the most basic act of self-preservation or comfort, is a psychological torture perhaps equal to the physical pain. You are aware you are suffering and you can do nothing. Zooming out, this utter subjugation is the core political message of Scaphism. This punishment wasn't just about killing a traitor or criminal. It was about demonstrating absolute, unchallengeable power. By reducing a human being to this state of complete physical and mental paralysis, utterly dependent on their captors even for the continuation of their agony, the state asserts total control. It says we can not only take your life, but we can utterly strip away your will, your body's integrity, your very humanity, transforming you into an object of controlled suffering. It's a terrifying exhibition of sovereign power, the power to inflict any form of suffering imaginable, to cross any boundary of human dignity. Think about the concept of control. In this boat, you have none. Not over your body, not over your environment, not even over your basic biological functions, which have been weaponized against you. Your mind, assaulted by constant pain, filth, and the biological horror unfolding, begins to break down. It's a designed process. They bind the body, create the environment, introduce the agents of decay, and maintain the conditions, all specifically to ensure this complete, agonizing breakdown of a human being, witnessed from the inside by that same breaking mind. Your body is becoming less and less your own. It's a host, it's food, it's a site of decay. The feeling of things moving on you in you is constant. The boundaries of yourself are dissolving, not just physically, but mentally. Who are you when your body is a landscape of suffering and consumption? When every sensation is pain and violation? When your thoughts are fragments scattered by delirium? You are becoming the creature in the boat, the thing that smells of rot and honey, surrounded by a buzzing cloud, patiently waiting. Perhaps in moments of fleeting clarity, the sheer absurdity of it all strikes you. Bound, fed milk and honey, left to be consumed by insects and waste. It's a nightmare concocted by a mind that married cruelty with biological insight. But such clarity is brief. The pain is a rising tide, the flies a constant veil, the maggots a relentless, squirming reality beneath the surface. You are trapped in the final, agonizing stages of this unique unmaking. And soon, the process will reach its grim conclusion, though not before every last drop of suffering has been extracted. But who is witnessing this ultimate degradation? Who administers the final, grim acts of this horrific punishment? The world outside the boat still exists, and they are part of this macabre performance. You're lost in the haze of pain and delirium now, trapped in that horrifying feedback loop of filth and feasting. But what about the world outside the boat? Was this ordeal a private agony, hidden away from prying eyes, a secret horror enacted behind palace walls? Or was it, as some accounts suggest, a public spectacle? The sources are somewhat debated on this, but the sheer elaborateness of the punishment, requiring daily interaction, the feeding, implies it wasn't simply a case of leaving someone in a field to die. It was managed, and managing such a horrific process often suggests an audience, or at least a demonstration. Imagine the possibility. You, encased in your wooden shell, reeking of rot and honey, covered in flies, the soft sounds of biological decay emanating from within the boat. Placed in a public square, or perhaps just outside the city gates, a grim warning posted for all to see. The sheer, visceral horror would be undeniable. The smell alone would carry, a sickening testament to the fate awaiting enemies of the state. People would avert their eyes, cover their mouths, hurry past, but the image, the knowledge, would be seared into their minds. A living monument to the price of defiance. Zooming out, this is where the political potency of Scaphism is fully realized. It wasn't just about killing this individual. It was about terrifying everyone else. A standard execution might deter some, but a death like this slow, humiliating, utterly repulsive, turning the body into a literal breeding ground of decay, that speaks a different language of power. It says, we can take away your life, and in the process, we can take away everything you understand about yourself, about cleanliness, about dignity. We can turn you into a walking corpse, a feast for worms, while you are still alive. Defy us at your peril. It's the ultimate expression of state control, not just over life and death, but over the very process of physical disintegration. This is political irony at its most brutal, the state, the supposed protector of order, actively creating chaos and horror out of a human body for the sake of maintaining order. And what of those who administered this? The guards, the servants, the executioners who had to approach the boat daily. They had to mix the milk and honey, approach the reeking, buzzing vessel, lift the head of a person in the advanced stages of decomposition, and force-feed them. They had to witness the flies, the maggots, the raw flesh, the delirium. Did they become desensitized? Was it just a job, a grim duty carried out without emotion, or did it haunt their dreams? There's a chilling banality to the process if you think about it from their perspective, the routine task of maintaining a state of exquisite suffering. The guards weren't just static figures. They were active participants in this living death sentence, their daily actions fueling the very horror they were guarding. This adds another layer of discomfort, the ordinary people involved in the execution of the extraordinary. The sounds might carry, the constant buzz, the faint cries perhaps, before the victim was too weak or delirious. The sight would be unforgettable, the smell inescapable. If public, it wasn't just a death. It was a performance art of absolute subjugation and biological horror. It would have been a potent, if infrequent, reminder to everyone's citizens and potential rebels alike of the terrifying capabilities of the ruling power. It etched fear not just through pain, but through profound disgust and the violation of every natural human aversion. Back in the boat, the sounds from outside are muffled, distant. The buzzing in your ears, the squirming on your skin, the roaring agony within are the only realities that hold meaning. But the existence of that outside world, the possibility that eyes are watching, that people are witnessing your final, degrading hours, adds another layer to the torment. You are not just dying, you are being displayed. Your unmaking is a message. Your suffering is a deterrent. And as your body weakens, the feeding becomes more difficult, the delirium deepens, you are drifting towards the inevitable, but not before the world, or at least those tasked with overseeing your end, have borne witness to the ultimate, engineered horror of Scaphism. The process is nearing its conclusion, not with a bang, but with a slow biological dissolution that serves as a grim reflection on the nature of power and punishment in the ancient world. But what does such inventive cruelty tell us about ourselves across the vast gulf of time? You are now just a state of being. Pain, stench, the constant, maddening feeling of things consuming you. The body is failing, the mind is dissolving, trapped in this unspeakable state. But let's pull back, way back, from the putrid confines of that wooden boat and look across the landscape of history. Scaphism stands out, even among the grim gallery of ancient punishments. We know of crucifixion, agonizing, public, humiliating. We know of impalement, a brutal, shocking violation, often prolonged, drawing and quartering, a sudden, violent dismemberment, burning at the stake, a horrific, fiery end. But Scaphism feels different, more insidious. It's not just brute force or a swift, albeit painful, destruction. It's a process of calculated biological horror. It's the invention of a way to kill someone by turning their own body and natural processes into weapons against them. It weaponizes decay, waste, and the lowest forms of life. It's not just killing, it's unmaking. It's forcing the victim to inhabit, for days, a state of living putrefaction. What kind of mind conceives of this? Zooming out to a moral reflection, what does the invention of Scaphism tell us about the human capacity for cruelty and about the values of the societies that potentially employed it? It suggests a view of the condemned that is less than human, someone whose physical integrity and suffering hold no value whatsoever. Punishment isn't just about removing them from society or making them suffer a consequence. It's about annihilating their dignity, about making their death as repulsive and drawn out as physically possible. It speaks to a world where the boundaries of acceptable suffering were vastly different, where the purpose of punishment might have been seen not just as justice or deterrence, but perhaps even as a form of grotesque purification, cleansing the state by reducing the impure to something that is quite literally consumed by the earth's cleaning agents. Insects and decay. Think about that cultural blind spot. Our modern sensibilities are utterly revolted by Scaphism. We have concepts like cruel and unusual punishment, laws against torture, and a general, if sometimes aspirational, belief in the inherent dignity of the human body, even in death. The fact that Scaphism exists, even as a possibly exaggerated account from hostile sources, highlights a vast moral chasm between that ancient mindset and our own. It forces us to confront how drastically human values regarding pain, the body, and punishment have shifted, or perhaps, how thin the veneer of civilization can be when the goal is absolute power and the suppression of dissent at any cost. It asks, what horrors are we capable of when we see another human being not as a person, but as an obstacle, a symbol, or simply a body to be repurposed for a message? The accounts, as mentioned, largely come from Greek historians like Herodotus and Plutarch, writing centuries ago. There's always debate about the complete accuracy of such lurid descriptions, especially when they come from sources describing an enemy empire. Were they exaggerated for propaganda purposes? Possibly. Was it a widely used punishment, or a rare, extreme measure reserved for the most heinous crimes or enemies? We don't know for sure, but the very fact that the concept exists, that someone could imagine this method of torture and death and attribute it to a powerful empire, is revealing in itself. It tells us about the extremes of human ingenuity when applied to inflicting suffering, and about the terrifying possibilities that exist in the darker corners of the human mind. Even if Scaphism was rare or partly mythological, it represents a terrifying archetype, the engineered, agonizing death that uses natural processes to facilitate suffering. It's a stark reminder that history isn't a comfortable progression towards ever-increasing kindness. It's a messy, complex journey, punctuated by moments of profound cruelty and invention. It forces us to look at our own capacity for creating suffering, not just with swords and fires, but with calculated, intimate, biological horror. The boat is rotting, the flies are buzzing, and the process is nearing its inevitable end. But the unsettling questions it raises linger, reaching across the millennia, demanding we consider the darkness we are capable of, and the terrifying ways power can manifest itself upon the body. What does this ultimate dissolution, this unmaking in a box, finally conclude with, and what chilling echo does it leave for us today? So you were in the boat, strapped down, force-fed, marinated in your own waste, covered in milk and honey, and consumed slowly from the outside and within by a buzzing, crawling, feeding nightmare. That was Scaphism. Not a quick, clean end, but a deliberate, protracted process of unmaking. A death designed to violate every natural human aversion to filth, to insects, to decay, to absolute helplessness. It was a punishment that didn't just take your life. It took your dignity, your bodily integrity, and arguably your very humanity, transforming you into a biological horror show for days on end. The accounts are ancient, sometimes debated, filtered through centuries and rival cultures. We can't know with absolute certainty every detail or how often this was truly inflicted. But the idea of it, the fact that this form of torment could be conceived and recorded, is chilling enough. It represents a peak, or perhaps a nadir, of human creativity when applied to the task of inflicting suffering. It was torture engineered not just for pain, but for profound biological humiliation and decomposition, while the victim was still alive to feel it, smell it, and understand, however dimly through the haze of delirium, that their body had become a feasting ground. Zooming out one last time, let's consider the echoes of Scaphism. We recoil from it today with instinctive horror. We have evolved, or at least our stated ideals have, to reject punishments that are cruel and unusual. We talk about human rights, the dignity of the individual, even in death. Yet the core elements of Scaphism, extreme helplessness, violation of bodily integrity, prolonged suffering, the use of the body itself as a site of punishment. Can we truly say those are entirely absent from our history since, or even from aspects of the modern world? Not the method, thankfully, but the intent to break a person down utterly, to strip away their agency, to use their physical being as a tool of control or punishment. Think about the sheer inventiveness of the cruelty. It wasn't enough to stab or stone or burn. They found a way to turn nourishment into decay, confinement into a breeding ground, and the natural world into an army of tormentors. It required observation, a grim understanding of biology, and a willingness to push the boundaries of what was considered a punishment. It forces us to confront a disturbing truth: that the capacity for inventing new and more agonizing ways to hurt each other seems to be a dark constant throughout history. And that smell, can you still almost conjure it? The cloying sweetness, the sharp, metallic tang, the heavy, sickening odor of decay. That was the signature of Scaphism, a stench designed to repel, to warn, to linger long after the victim had finally succumbed to shock, infection, or total system failure. It was the smell of absolute power, absolute control, and the utter, horrifying vulnerability of the human body when it is subjected to the darkest corners of human ingenuity. We don't have the boat today. The Achaemenid Empire is dust, but the questions Scaphism raises about power, punishment, dignity, and our own capacity for both creating and recoiling from horror. Those questions still buzz around us, like flies drawn to something unsettling. It reminds us that history's most uncomfortable truths often lie not in grand battles or famous names, but in the visceral, horrifying details of how one human being treated another when given the power to do anything they wished. The questions raised by Scaphism do linger, don't they, buzzing around us, about the lengths of human cruelty, the vulnerability of the body, the sheer invention of suffering. It's a heavy thought to carry. But history, in its unsettling way, never stays confined to one boat or one empire or even one distinct smell of decay. As those echoes begin to soften, feel the currents of time gently shift again, pulling us away from the sun-baked, insect-filled air towards a different horizon, a colder one perhaps, a place of long ships and sagas, where legends mingle with brutal realities, and the line between the two is often blurred, smeared with something dark and visceral. While we've been contemplating the slow, horrifying unmaking of the body in the Achaemenid world, whispers from the north suggest another, equally infamous, and perhaps even more ritualistic form of violation. One etched not by insects or decay, but by cold steel and deliberate, agonizing artistry. A practice so grim, its very existence is still debated, leading us now to examine the gruesome truth of Viking blood eagles. Myth or barbaric reality? Step with me now out of the cloying heat and into the salt spray and cold steel of the Viking Age. Forget the horned helmets. They're a Victorian fantasy, useful only for confusing tourists. Think instead of wood smoke, strained leather, the low thrum of a longship cutting through icy water, and the ever-present tang of blood and the sea. This wasn't a time of gentlefolk exchanging pleasantries over tea. This was a world forged in raid and retaliation, where power was taken, not given, and debts were often paid in lives, brutally and publicly. It's a world that feels distant, alien, yet disturbingly human in its capacity for both incredible endurance and chilling invention. And few images from this era claw their way into the modern mind quite like the blood eagle. It's a story whispered in sagas, splashed across historical fiction, and debated fiercely by historians. But what was it, allegedly, and did it ever truly happen? Or is it just a particularly nasty piece of Viking propaganda, a myth designed to make their enemies sleep even less soundly? Imagine, if you can, being dragged before a Viking lord, perhaps a man like Ivar the Boneless, whose very nickname sounds like a threat whispered in the dark. You've wronged him or his family or his gods, and now comes the reckoning. The procedure, as described in later accounts, begins not with a quick sword stroke, but something far more intimate. You are thrown face down. Your arms and legs are restrained. The cold, sharp edge of an axe or knife presses against your back, just beside the spine. The first cut is made, deep, tracing a line from the neck down towards the lower back. Then a matching cut on the other side. Already, the air would be thick with the coppery smell, the ground slicking beneath you. The sounds, your own ragged breathing, the strained grunt of the executioner, perhaps the murmur of onlookers. It's an agony designed not just to kill, but to reshape, to turn a man's back into a canvas of torment. The details of this horrifying tableau come primarily from Norse sagas and poems written centuries after the Viking Age itself. Texts like the Orkneyinga saga or Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla describe rulers like Halfdan Longlegs or King Ella of Northumbria suffering this fate. These sources are rich in detail, certainly painting vivid pictures of a brutal past. But they are also literature, written for entertainment, political messaging, and moral instruction. They are stories, not necessarily unbiased historical records carved into stone the moment after the deed was done. And that right there is the heart of the unsettling puzzle. We have graphic accounts of something utterly barbaric, but can we trust the tellers? Because the described act doesn't stop with those initial cuts. Oh no. According to the accounts, the executioner would then use the blade to actually sever the ribs from the spine, snap, one by agonizing one. Imagine that sound, feel that impossible pressure. Then, with the ribs freed, they weren't simply removed. They were, the saga's claim, pulled outwards, spread wide, arranged to look like wings, still attached to the skin and muscle, forced outwards and upwards, a macabre, still living sculpture, and the final grotesque flourish. The lungs, still desperately trying to draw breath, would be pulled out through the gaping wounds in the back and draped over the splayed ribs. Steam rising in the cold air, perhaps, the ragged gasps turning to wet, gurgling sounds. Your own lungs exposed, catching the wind like the wings of a blood eagle. This isn't just killing, this is symbolism. This is an act heavy with meaning, transforming the victim into a grotesque, dying icon. If real, it wasn't just about punishment. It was about degradation, a message carved into flesh and bone, a sacrifice perhaps, or the ultimate display of dominance. What does it say about a culture that could conceive of such a thing? Even just in literature, it forces us to confront the uncomfortable thought that human inventiveness extends not just to tools of creation, but to instruments of horrifying, ritualized destruction. It asks us to consider what justice or retribution looked like when filtered through the lens of gods who demanded blood and power that was absolute. You wouldn't survive this, of course. Not for long. Shock, blood loss, organ collapse. The end would be swift, relatively speaking, after the impossible agony of the procedure itself. But the image would remain. The mangled body displayed, a warning, a sacrifice received, a legend born in blood and bone. The final ragged breath catching in those exposed, ruined organs, a sound that would haunt the witnesses long after you were gone. But again, did anyone ever actually witness this outside the pages of a saga? That's the question that divides historians. Some argue it's simply too anatomically complex, too survivable for such a crude age, or perhaps a mistranslation or embellishment of less gruesome events. Others point to the brutality of the age, the ritualistic nature of Viking society, and say, yes, they were capable of this. This wasn't just a story, it was a terrifying possibility, and diving into that debate. The clash between legendary horror and historical skepticism is where our journey truly begins. What evidence do we actually have for this ultimate act of Viking cruelty? And as you ponder the sheer physical violation described, wonder how easily myth can bleed into perceived reality when the stories are this compelling. What uncomfortable truth lies just beneath the surface of these ancient tales? You might imagine that something as spectacular and horrifying as a blood eagle would be etched into history with a blade as sharp as the one allegedly used. You'd expect contemporary accounts, perhaps carvings, maybe even archaeological hints. But this is where the story gets slippery. The firmest footing we have for the blood eagle comes not from eyewitness reports or ancient rune stones carved in the heat of the moment, but from literature written centuries later. As you just heard, scholars point to around 7 prose and 2 poetic accounts, mostly from the 12th and 13th centuries, well after the classic Viking age had waned. Think of it. You're trying to confirm a brutal event from the 9th century using sources written closer to your time than to the event itself. It's like trying to confirm a detail about the American Civil War purely through a novel written in the 2040s. It's possible there's truth, sure, but you'd probably want some corroboration from, the 1860s. These later accounts feature some big names from Viking lore. There's the famous story of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons supposedly performing the rite on King Aelle of Northumbria as revenge for their father's death. Another tale describes Halfdan Longlegs suffering the same fate at the hands of Eystein Glumra. The sagas describe these moments with grim relish, but when you lean in closer, the details are often inconsistent, bordering on the folkloric. The victims are sometimes legendary figures themselves, their deaths perhaps serving a narrative purpose, proving the terrifying might or the divine vengeance of the Viking protagonists. These aren't dry historical chronicles. They are vibrant, often exaggerated tales told to entertain, to glorify ancestors, and perhaps to seriously freak out anyone who might consider messing with their descendants. The descriptions are sometimes poetic, even metaphorical, rather than clinical. And this is where the historical uncertainty really sinks its teeth. In many modern historians look at the saga descriptions and frankly, they wince, not just at the implied pain, but at the historical method. Their arguments against a literal blood eagle are compelling. Firstly, there's the anatomical challenge. Severing ribs from the spine and pulling them out while a person is still alive enough for their lungs to be fluttering is, shall we say, ambitious for the medical knowledge and tools of the era. The victim would likely die from shock and blood loss almost immediately after the initial cuts, let alone the rib severing and lung pulling. The sagas make it sound like a drawn-out ritual, which anatomically just doesn't seem feasible in a literal sense. It feels more like symbolic violation than a practical method of execution. So, if not a literal execution, what else could these accounts be describing? This is where the interpretations get fascinating, drawing on the fact that the sagas often contain skaldic poetry, complex, metaphorical verse. Some scholars propose that the blood eagle wasn't a physical act at all, but a vivid, perhaps deliberately shocking, poetic description of a different kind of death or mutilation. Could it refer to severe back wounds that left a scar pattern resembling an eagle? Ritualistic scarring, perhaps, rather than fatal dissection. Or maybe it's a kenning, a poetic compound metaphor, for something like leaving an enemy's body exposed on the battlefield for scavenging birds of prey to consume, a deep humiliation in a society that valued proper burial. Imagine a warrior saying, "We gave him to the blood eagle," meaning, we left his body for the carrion birds after a bloody fight. It's a much less literal, but still grim and plausible interpretation of poetic language. The sagas could be taking a metaphorical description from earlier, more obscure poems and reinterpreting it literally, centuries later. Even if the blood eagle never actually happened, the story itself is powerful. Why invent or perpetuate such a gruesome tale? Think about it from the perspective of someone encountering the Vikings. Stories of this kind of ritualistic horror would spread like wildfire, inspiring terror far beyond the reach of any actual raid. It's psychological warfare, an early form of propaganda. It makes your enemies hesitate. It cements your reputation as utterly ruthless, bound by different rules, capable of unimaginable acts. The legend of the blood eagle, whether fact or fiction, served to amplify the already formidable and terrifying image of the Vikings in the minds of those who wrote about them, particularly the Christian chroniclers, who already viewed them through a lens of fear and moral condemnation. It fit neatly into the narrative of pagan barbarity versus Christian civilization, regardless of its historical veracity. The image of the blood eagle persists. It's burned into our collective imagination. The severed ribs, the splayed wings, the exposed lungs. It speaks to a primal fear, the violation of the body, transformation into something grotesque and alien. It's a visceral picture hard to shake, precisely because it's so extreme, so outside the norms of what we consider execution or punishment. It embodies the otherness that medieval writers projected onto the Vikings, a people operating by a different, seemingly crueler code. And so, you are left with a stark choice. Do you believe the literal, horrifying accounts in the sagas, accepting the anatomical implausibility and the late date of the sources? Or do you lean towards the skeptical academic view, seeing the blood eagle as a vivid metaphor, a misunderstanding of poetry or propaganda? There's no definitive archaeological proof, no skeletons found with backs surgically altered in this way. The evidence is literary, and those texts are notoriously tricky mirrors of reality. The uncomfortable truth here isn't just about the potential for barbaric acts, but about the fragility of historical knowledge itself, especially when the most compelling stories are also the hardest to verify. As you weigh the possibilities, the raw horror of the alleged act against the cold logic of historical doubt, remember that history is often less about finding simple answers and more about grappling with complex, often unsettling questions. And our journey into the grim possibilities of Viking justice is far from over. What happens when we look beyond the sagas and into the archaeological record? Does the earth itself hold any secrets about Viking brutality? If the sagas offer us compelling, yet questionable stories, perhaps the earth itself holds a more reliable, albeit silent, truth. Archaeology is history's attempt to listen to the whispers from beneath the soil, to piece together lives and deaths from bones, artifacts, and the very ground they were laid in. For something like the blood eagle, a ritual so deeply physical, so utterly transformative of the body, you might expect it to leave some trace. A specific pattern of cuts on a ribcage, perhaps. Bones showing signs of deliberate, agonizing separation from the spine. Something definitive, buried alongside other markers of Viking presence. But this is where the archaeological record, for all its richness in other areas of Viking life, their ships, their tools, their trade routes, their everyday violence, remains stubbornly, perhaps tellingly, silent on this specific practice. Archaeology does confirm that the Viking Age was incredibly brutal. Excavations have unearthed mass graves, often from raids or battles, filled with the bodies of men, women, and children killed violently. Skeletons bear the marks of battle, sword cuts, axe blows, spear punctures. Some show signs of execution or ritual killing. Decapitations are relatively common finds, sometimes with heads placed deliberately with the body or in separate pits. There's evidence of binding, of deliberate mutilation, of bodies being treated with disrespect or used to send a message. We see skeletons with fractured skulls, severed limbs, or multiple weapon injuries. The Viking world wasn't shy about violence. It's written in the bones they left behind. But amidst this grim archaeological landscape of confirmed brutality, the specific, intricate trauma described by the Blood Eagle saga accounts simply hasn't appeared. No burial site, no battlefield grave, no isolated skeleton has been found displaying the clear, unmistakable signs of having its ribs detached from the spine and splayed outwards while still attached to the rest of the body. If this was a known form of execution, even a rare one reserved for particularly hated enemies or significant ritual sacrifices, you'd expect at least one example to surface over decades of excavation across Scandinavia and the lands they raided and settled. This absence, while not definitive proof it never happened, weighs heavily against the literal interpretation of the sagas. It forces a moral reflection. Is it possible that the horrifying tales we tell ourselves about history are sometimes more extreme than the already brutal reality? Of course, finding evidence of the Blood Eagle isn't as simple as just digging holes. Bodies decay, bones are scattered. Later disturbances can mix remains, and even if a body were subjected to the procedure, identifying it centuries later would be incredibly difficult. Forensic archaeologists look for specific trauma patterns, cut marks, breaks, dislocations. But identifying whether ribs were deliberately detached while the person was alive versus post-mortem mutilation or scavenging is a complex task. The specific details from the sagas, the lungs being pulled out, would leave no lasting bone trace. So, while archaeology is our best bet for physical confirmation, the nature of the alleged act makes definitive identification a forensic nightmare, even if a potential candidate were found. This isn't like finding a bullet hole or a clear decapitation mark. It's nuanced, requires incredible preservation, and ideally context. The contrast is stark. The sagas scream about the Blood Eagle, a dramatic, ritualized, symbolic act. The archaeology whispers of blunt force trauma, sharp force trauma, mass burials, decapitations, the practical, brutal realities of warfare and punishment. The most famous alleged Viking atrocity leaves no physical trace, while the everyday violence is etched into countless bones. There's a kind of symbolic absurdity in that, isn't there? The grand, terrifying legend remains frustratingly unconfirmed, by the very ground that should hold its secrets, while the less theatrical but equally grim acts are laid bare for all to see. It makes you wonder what other historical horrors are vividly described in texts, but left no physical footprint, lost to decay, or simply products of exaggerated storytelling stand in a museum before a Viking skeleton, perhaps one with a clearly healed axe wound or the sharp cut across a vertebra from a sword. And feel the silence. These bones endured violence, survived some of it, succumbed to the rest. They speak of a harsh life and often a brutal death, but they don't, at least not yet, scream of ribs snapped from spines and splayed like wings. They offer a different narrative of Viking violence, one of sudden blows, of battlefields and raids, of executions that left clearer marks. So, after sifting through the literary tailies and probing the silent earth, where are we? The case for the blood eagle as a widespread, historically confirmed execution method remains weak, perhaps even non-existent in a literal sense. The evidence points more towards it being a powerful, terrifying story that evolved over time, perhaps from misinterpretations of poetry or exaggerations of less elaborate tortures or mutilations. But the idea of it, the sheer invention of such a gruesome ritual, tells us something profound about the Viking mindset as perceived by others, and perhaps about their own capacity for violence, even if only in narrative form. And as you consider this gap between chilling legend and uncertain archaeological reality, you're left to ponder. Why does this particular story, this unconfirmed horror, resonate so strongly? What cultural anxieties or fascinations does the image of the blood eagle tap into? Even 1,000 years later, what other dark corners of history are illuminated not by hard fact, but by the terrifying power of a story well told, regardless of its truth? So, if the archaeological record is silent and the literary accounts are late and possibly poetic, why does the idea of the blood eagle persist so powerfully? Why did the saga writers include it, and why did it stick? Let's consider the sheer, horrifying utility of such a story. Imagine you're a Viking chieftain carving out a name and territory through fear and force. You raid across the seas, facing enemies who might resist, who might even fight back fiercely. What's the best way to demoralize them before you even land? Reputation. Stories of your ruthlessness, your capacity for unimaginable cruelty are worth 100 longships. A foe who believes you might not just kill them, but subject them to a ritual that transforms their dying body into a grotesque effigy. Well, they might just surrender or flee before the battle even begins. The blood eagle, in this light, becomes a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It targets not just the body, but the very concept of dignity in death. In a warrior society like the Viking one, death was often expected, even embraced, especially if it meant entering Valhalla. But the blood eagle wasn't a glorious death in battle. It was a humiliating, agonizing spectacle, a perversion of the human form. It stripped the victim of their warrior's end and turned them into a bloody, feathered monument to the victor's power. It was designed to terrorize onlookers, to ensure absolute submission through fear. Think about it. Your warriors are already formidable, but the stories about what they might do to you are even more terrifying. It's the difference between facing a wolf and facing a wolf you believe might wear your skin as a coat. One is dangerous, the other is existentially horrifying. Viking society was deeply structured around concepts of honor, loyalty, and crucially, vengeance. If someone wronged you, your family, or your lord, there was a strong expectation of retaliation. This could take many forms, from financial compensation to feuds and killings. But some offenses were seen as so egregious, so deeply insulting, that only the most extreme vengeance would suffice. The sagas often portray the blood eagle as an act of ultimate vengeance, particularly for the death of a beloved father. It's a way of saying, you didn't just kill our kin, you committed an unforgivable sin, and your punishment will reflect the absolute depth of our rage and sorrow etched onto your very being. It raises a difficult moral question. Does the concept of honor in a warrior culture justify, or at least contextualize, extreme cruelty in retribution? Or is there a line of barbarity that even a society built on vengeance should not cross? And did the Vikings, in reality, draw that line differently than the saga writers portrayed? While the blood eagle's literal existence is debated, Viking society certainly wasn't devoid of ritualistic violence or extreme punishment. They practiced human sacrifice, particularly in religious contexts, though the details are debated and likely varied by region and time. The sagas mention sacrificing captives to Odin, sometimes through hanging or spear wounds. Archaeological evidence from sites like the rib-worshipping grove in Norway includes post holes that may have supported sacrificial victims. There are accounts of blood rituals, oaths sworn over rings dipped in sacrificial blood, and gruesome executions for specific crimes. Think of the practice of nith, public shaming, often involving sexual humiliation or accusations of cowardice, which could be so damaging to a man's honor that it was considered a worse fate than death. While none of these exactly match the blood eagle, they show a culture capable of integrating violence, ritual, and public spectacle in ways that feel deeply alien to modern sensibilities. The blood eagle, if real, would fit into this spectrum of extreme acts, perhaps as the apex of vengeful ritual killing. But the lack of physical evidence still screams louder than the textual whispers in the ears of many historians, and we must always remember who was doing the writing. The sagas and poems come from a time when Iceland and Norway were converting or had converted to Christianity. Christian writers often depicted the pagan past as darker, more barbaric, a time of unbridled cruelty and demonic influence, contrasting it with the perceived civility and justice of the new faith. Emphasizing horrors like the blood eagle served this narrative purpose. It solidified the otherness of the pagan Vikings, making the Christian conversion seem all the more necessary and righteous. It's a potent example of how history can be filtered and shaped by the perspectives, biases, and agendas of those who record it. The saga writers weren't historians in the modern sense. They were bards, poets, genealogists, and sometimes monks or chieftains with their own reasons for portraying the past in a certain light. Despite the historical uncertainty, the image of the blood eagle has sunk deep into modern culture. It appears in TV shows, movies, novels, and video games. Often, It's depicted in graphic detail, leaning into the most literal and brutal interpretations of the saga accounts. Why? Because it's incredibly dramatic. It's a visually striking, viscerally shocking act of cruelty that instantly signifies Viking barbarity to a modern audience. It fulfills our expectation of a savage, brutal past, even if that expectation is shaped more by myth than documented fact. We are fascinated by extreme violence, and the Blood Eagle offers an almost ritualized, artistic form of it, a terrifying tableau that is hard to forget. So here we are, caught between the power of a horrifying story and the frustrating silence of the physical evidence. The Blood Eagle might be a vivid metaphor misunderstood, a piece of brilliant propaganda, an exaggerated account of real but less spectacular cruelty, or perhaps, just perhaps, a rare but actual act of vengeance from a brutal age. The debate itself is a kind of symbolic absurdity. We are meticulously dissecting the possibility of a ritual dissection that might never have happened. But in doing so, we learn not just about Viking society, but about the nature of historical sources, the power of myth, and our own enduring fascination with the darkest corners of the human capacity for violence. And as you consider the reasons why such a grim legend would take hold and refuse to let go, why the idea of a man's back being turned into a dying eagle still sends a shiver down your spine, what other historical horrors lurk in the space between fact and fiction, gaining power precisely because of their uncertain, terrifying nature? Let's shift our focus slightly. If the literal Blood Eagle remains unproven, what does the concept itself tell us? What does it reveal about the minds that conceived of it, celebrated it in sagas, and passed it down through generations? This is perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, that humans are capable of not just brutality, but of imagining, narrativizing, and potentially enacting violence that is symbolic, ritualized, and designed for maximum physical and psychological impact. The Blood Eagle, whether it ever drew actual blood in this specific manner, is a window into a cultural mindset where the enemy's body was not merely something to be killed, but something to be transformed, violated, and used as a canvas for a terrifying message. It tells us that in certain historical contexts, the boundaries of acceptable cruelty were radically different from our own. Consider the psychological dimension, even if the physical act was abbreviated by shock. The sheer terror for the victim lies not just in the pain, which would be unimaginable, but in the deliberate, agonizing transformation of their body before their eyes. You are being unmade, reshaped into something monstrous, something that signifies your utter defeat and the absolute power of your tormentor. The ritualistic nature of the act, the precise cuts, the spreading of the ribs, suggests a purpose beyond mere killing. It implies a calculated performance, a public spectacle intended to deeply traumatize anyone who witnessed it, solidifying the reputation of the perpetrator as someone capable of the ultimate violation. Imagine being forced to watch this happen to someone you knew or someone who represented your community. It would be a horror that burrowed deep into your psyche, a visceral lesson in the cost of defiance. The prominence of the Blood Eagle in stories of vengeance, particularly for grave insults or the death of important kin, underscores the central role of Hefend in Viking Age society. This wasn't just personal retribution. It was often a matter of family honor, social standing, and legal obligation. Failing to avenge a wrong could bring shame and weakness upon your entire lineage. The blood eagle, in this context, becomes the ultimate act of vengeance, a punishment that is not just fatal but utterly devastating, designed to inflict maximum dishonor and pain on the enemy's line by desecrating their champion. It suggests a cultural acceptance, at least narratively, of violence as a means of restoring balance and demonstrating power, with seemingly few perceived limits when honor was at stake. This stands in stark contrast to modern legal systems and ethical frameworks that emphasize concepts like proportionality in punishment, due process, and the inherent dignity of the human body, even in death. The act of shaping the splayed ribs and lungs into the form of an eagle is profoundly symbolic. The eagle was a powerful image in Norse mythology, associated with Odin and also a common scavenger. By transforming the victim into a blood eagle, the ritual could be read on multiple levels. A sacrifice to Odin, a declaration of absolute dominance, a gruesome display of the defeated enemy's vulnerability, or perhaps a grim acknowledgement that their body would become carrion. It is a transformation from a warrior or a king into a grotesque, dying bird, stripped of human dignity and reduced to a visceral symbol of the victor's might. The body becomes a message board, the ultimate propaganda tool, etched in suffering and blood. Here is where the most uncomfortable clash occurs. Modern ethics, influenced heavily by human rights philosophy and a concept of inherent dignity, recoil from the very idea of the blood eagle. We believe, ideally, that even those accused of the most heinous crimes deserve a basic level of humane treatment, that the state does not have the right to inflict gratuitous pain or violate the body for symbolic effect. The blood eagle, if real or even just vividly imagined and celebrated, represents a world where such constraints were not merely absent, but where the opposite was true, where the more agonizing, the more humiliating, the more symbolic the punishment, the more effective it was considered. This ethical gulf forces us to confront how drastically human values regarding suffering, vengeance, and the sanctity of the body have shifted over centuries, and how contingent our modern sensibilities might be on specific historical and philosophical developments. So, why does this specific, debated act still give us pause? It's not just the gore, it's the deliberate, cold artistry of it. It's the transformation. It's the idea of a body being worked on while still alive, turned into something else. It taps into a deep-seated fear of losing control over our own physical form, of being reduced to raw material for someone else's horrifying display. That visceral discomfort we feel is a direct result of the clash between the cultural mindset that could conceive of such a thing and our own. The blood eagle, whether enacted or only imagined, serves as a powerful, disturbing reflection. It shows us the depths of cruelty that human cultures are capable of contemplating, particularly in the context of absolute power, vengeance, and the dehumanization of enemies. It highlights the fragility of the body and the terrifying potential for its symbolic violation. And it forces us to consider that some of the most haunting historical truths might reside not just in what people did, but in what they were willing to imagine and believe about the suffering they could inflict. And as you grapple with what this chilling concept reveals about the darker side of human nature and the vast differences in historical values, you might find yourself asking, were there other, perhaps less famous, but equally bizarre and disturbing punishments or rituals that reveal similar unsettling truths about past societies and their relationship with the body, suffering, and death? You've just grappled with the unnerving possibility that one of history's most infamous tortures might be more story than fact. A chilling legend, perhaps, but unconfirmed by the silent earth. But let's be absolutely clear. History isn't lacking in well-documented, horrifying methods of inflicting pain and death. Far from it. While the debate around the blood eagle highlights the tricky nature of historical evidence, a vast and grim library of confirmed, state-sanctioned violence exists. These weren't whispered legends. They were often public spectacles, codified in law, carried out with chilling regularity across cultures and centuries. They reveal a different, equally unsettling truth. That the body has always been, and often remains, the ultimate territory upon which power is asserted, crimes are punished, and dissent is crushed. Forget the ritualistic potential of the blood eagle for a moment, and step into the verifiable reality of historical state cruelty. Consider impalement. Unlike the horizontal violation of Scaphism or the back-focused torment of the alleged blood eagle, this was a vertical, public, agonizing assertion of dominance. While practiced by various cultures, from the ancient Assyrians graphically depicting it on their palace walls as a warning, its most infamous proponent in later history was Vlad III Dracula of Wallachia. Imagine the scene: sharpened stakes, sometimes greased, waiting in rows outside city walls. And then the victim, not just killed but carefully, deliberately hoisted and lowered onto the stake. The aim was not a quick piercing, but for the stake to enter the body, often through the anus or vagina, and emerge somewhere else, perhaps the shoulder or mouth, without piercing vital organs too quickly. The goal was a slow, public, agonizing death that could last for hours, even days. Your own weight would force you further down the stake with every desperate, ragged breath. The pain, constant, searing, internal. Exposed to the elements, to public view, to the slow, inevitable failure of your own body. Why such a drawn-out, agonizing, and public method? Impalement was a powerful political statement. For the Assyrians, it was a symbol of imperial might, a graphic warning to rebellious cities. Surrender, or this is your fate. For Vlad, ruling a frontier principality constantly threatened by larger empires, it was a means of instilling absolute terror and obedience in his own people and striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. Seeing hundreds, even thousands, of bodies impaled outside a city conveyed a message louder than any decree. This ruler is absolute, his vengeance is terrible, and resistance is futile. It's a chilling example of how extreme physical torment was used not just for punishment, but as a primary tool of statecraft, a grotesque form of communication etched in suffering and displayed for all to see move forward centuries into medieval and early modern Europe. Here another terrifying instrument of state power was the breaking wheel, or Catherine wheel. This wasn't about internal piercing, but external shattering trauma. The condemned, often convicted of heinous crimes like murder or highway robbery, would be tied to a large wooden wheel, sometimes with spokes arranged specifically to elevate parts of the body. Executioners would then use a heavy iron bar or hammer to systematically break the victim's bones, arms, legs, ribs, crack, shatter, one after another. The sounds alone would be horrific, echoing across the execution ground. The pain. Incomprehensible, as limb after limb was systematically broken while consciousness lingered. Sometimes, after the bones were broken, the victim might be left tied to the wheel to die slowly from shock, dehydration, and the sheer, impossible agony, or their broken body might be displayed on a pole. The breaking wheel wasn't about a quick death. It was about maximum suffering, public spectacle, and a punishment that mirrored the perceived severity of the crime through the shattering of the body. It was a display of the state's power over life and death, and its willingness to inflict unimaginable pain in the name of justice. It was also a deeply public event, meant to deter others by showcasing the terrifying consequences of defying the law. It forces us to reflect on what justice meant in societies where such calculated, prolonged suffering was considered an acceptable, even necessary, part of the legal system. What does it say about a culture that designs instruments specifically to maximize bone trauma and prolong agony? It speaks to a different relationship with pain, a different understanding of deterrence, and a stark contrast in how the value of a human life, particularly a condemned one, was perceived compared to modern standards. Finally, let's consider one of the most famous and widespread forms of execution in the ancient world. Crucifixion. Particularly associated with the Roman Empire, it was a punishment primarily reserved for slaves, rebels, pirates, and non-citizens, those deemed beneath the dignity of a Roman execution, like decapitation. The victim would be stripped, often scourged first, and then either tied or nailed to a large wooden cross or a T-shaped structure. The points of attachment were typically the wrists or forearms and the feet. Hanging suspended, with your arms outstretched, breathing becomes increasingly difficult. The muscles in your chest and diaphragm strain. To exhale to get another breath, you have to push up with your legs, grinding against the nails or ropes, or pull down with your arms, tearing at the wounds. It is a slow death, primarily by asphyxiation and exhaustion, combined with shock, blood loss from the wounds, and dehydration. Hours, sometimes days, of agonizing struggle for each breath. Crucifixion was not just an execution. It was a deliberate act of public humiliation and terror. Crosses were often erected along roadsides or outside city gates, leaving the dying or dead bodies exposed for all to see. It was a brutal, undeniable symbol of Roman authority. Defy us, and we will not only kill you, but we will do it in the most agonizing, humiliating way possible, parading your suffering as a warning. It was a punishment designed to strip the victim of all dignity in death, leaving them vulnerable, exposed, and dependent on the slow failure of their own body. Like impalement and the breaking wheel, it underscores how powerful states have historically used the body as a canvas for political messaging, using extreme violence to maintain control and enforce obedience among subject populations. These examples, impalement, the breaking wheel, crucifixion, lack the literary mystery of the blood eagle. They are confirmed by multiple contemporary sources, legal texts, artistic depictions, and even archaeological finds. They represent a verifiable, chilling reality of historical violence, driven by state power, social control, and the calculated infliction of pain for specific purposes. They are perhaps less bizarrely ritualistic than the blood eagle's alleged avian transformation, but no less horrifying in their deliberate, prolonged agony. Comparing these confirmed methods to the debated blood eagle offers a sobering perspective. While we might debate the specifics of one legendary Viking act, we cannot escape the undeniable fact that human history is replete with documented, inventive, and agonizing forms of cruelty enacted by states and societies upon individuals. These were not anomalies. In many places and times, they were the norm for certain crimes or certain classes of people. They force us to confront the enduring human capacity for designing and implementing systems of extreme suffering, and to recognize that the line between punishment and terror has historically been incredibly blurred, smeared with blood and bone. As you consider these verified horrors, starkly real and far more common than any potential blood eagle, you might find yourself wondering, what other forms of state control and social expectation drove people to inflict or endure such levels of violence? And what can everyday historical details tell us about living in a world where such things were commonplace? You've just walked through chilling galleries of state power asserted through agony, the stake, the wheel, the cross. These were instruments of control wielded by emperors and kings, reserved for rebels, criminals, or those deemed enemies of the state. But the reality of historical harshness wasn't confined to grand, public execution grounds. For most people, in most times, brutality wasn't just a potential fate delivered by an authority figure. It was woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant hum of discomfort, danger, and vulnerability that we, with our soft modern lives, can barely comprehend. Stepping back from the dramatic spectacle of official torture, we enter a world where the body was constantly at risk, not just from a ruler's wrath, but from disease, hunger, violence, and the sheer, grinding lack of resources and sanitation. This was a landscape where life expectancy was often shockingly low, and where the line between misfortune, illness, and divine punishment or witchcraft was constantly blurred. Imagine the smell. The pervasive odor of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, animal waste, and stagnant water that clung to everything. Personal hygiene, as we know it, was a luxury if it existed at all. Bathing was infrequent, often in communal, not particularly clean water. Latrines, where they existed, were often little more than pits, overflowing into streets or water sources. Fleas and lice were constant companions. Clean water was a precious commodity, often contaminated. Food preservation was rudimentary, leading to spoilage and sickness. Your body was not a pristine vessel. It was a leaky, vulnerable sack of flesh, constantly exposed to pathogens your immune system was ill-equipped to handle. A simple cut could turn deadly. A common cold could become pneumonia. Childbirth was a terrifying gamble for both mother and child. The everyday physical reality was one of pervasive, low-grade suffering and constant exposure to invisible, deadly threats. In a world without modern medicine, sickness wasn't just a biological event. It was often seen through a lens of morality, fate, or supernatural intervention. Plagues, diseases, even minor ailments were attributed to divine wrath, demonic possession, or the evil eye of a witch. Cures were a bizarre mix of folk remedies, herbalism, prayer, charms, bloodletting, and trepanning. You might seek help from a wise woman who used herbs and incantations, or a barber surgeon who might amputate a limb with rusty tools and a swig of alcohol, or a priest who would perform an exorcism. The body's ailments were treated with a blend of practical attempts and often strange, symbolic acts, reflecting a worldview where the physical and spiritual realms were deeply intertwined, and where control over your own health was minimal. This moral reflection on illness reveals a profound difference in how agency and responsibility for one's own suffering were understood beyond state executions. Violence was a more intimate, ever-present threat. Feuds between families or villages could erupt over perceived slights, land disputes, or stolen livestock, leading to ambushes, beatings, and murders. Banditry was common on roads. Drunken brawls in taverns could turn deadly. Justice at a local level could be swift, rough, and deeply unfair, often administered by local lords or community elders with little formal training and significant personal bias. Punishments for even minor crimes could be physically brutal: stocks, pillories, flogging, branding. Imagine being locked in the stocks, exposed to the scorn and abuse of your neighbors for something as simple as petty theft. Your body, confined and helpless, becomes a public spectacle of shame. This wasn't the dramatic, potentially legendary cruelty of a blood eagle, but the grinding, everyday reality of a society where law and order were fragile and physical punishment was a common deterrent. Survival itself was a constant negotiation with hardship. Famine was a recurring specter, dependent on the whims of weather and the stability of local governance. Taxes could be crippling. Lords could demand labor or resources without recourse. If your village was in the path of an invading army, whether Viking, Norman, or something else, your life and property were instantly forfeit. The structure of society, with its strict hierarchies and limited opportunities, meant that most people lived on the edge, their bodies and lives vulnerable to forces far beyond their control. The political irony here is clear. While grand narratives focus on kings and battles, the most profound hardship for the majority was the relentless, often anonymous, struggle against poverty, disease, and the casual brutality of everyday life in a world without safety nets. Feel the persistent ache in your bones from damp, cold living quarters. The gnawing emptiness in your stomach during lean seasons. The constant worry about the next harvest, the next tax collector, the next wave of sickness. The relief and terror of a successful hunt or a good crop. This was the physical reality for most people in historical periods, not necessarily facing the blood eagle, but facing a daily barrage of smaller, exhausting challenges that wore the body down and made life a fragile, often short possession. When we look back, the dramatic, extraordinary acts of violence, the debated blood eagle, the confirmed impalements capture our imagination. But perhaps the more profound historical truth lies in understanding the relentless, mundane hardships that were the norm for the vast majority. The dirt, the disease, the hunger, the constant low-level threat of violence, the lack of control over one's own physical well-being. These things often leave fewer dramatic traces in the historical record than a king's execution, but they shaped far more lives. They tell us that while legends might be born of spectacular cruelty, the daily grind of historical reality could be its own form of pervasive, body-breaking torment. And as you contemplate the difference between the horrifying legend and the widespread, mundane brutality of everyday history, you might wonder, how have these persistent historical anxieties about the body, control, and suffering manifested in different cultures? And what surprising connections can we find between distant societies when we look at their shared vulnerabilities? You've considered the grand, terrifying stage of state torture and the relentless, grinding hardships of everyday life. Both, in their own ways, highlight the body's fragility and its unfortunate utility as a canvas for power, punishment, or simply the inevitable consequences of a harsh existence. But how did people in these historical worlds grapple with the ultimate vulnerability, death itself? The anxiety around the body didn't end when the heart stopped beating. In many cultures, across vast distances and time periods, death rituals, burial practices, and beliefs about the afterlife encoded deep-seated fears, values, and sometimes practices that strike our modern sensibilities as profoundly strange, unsettling, or even morbid. They reveal a shared human struggle to exert some form of control, or at least understanding, over the uncontrollable final transition. They show us how societies have used the dead body to reinforce social norms, appease perceived spiritual threats, or maintain connections that transcended the physical step far away from the Viking longships and Roman crosses into the dense Amazon rainforest. Here, among certain groups of the Yanomami people, existed a practice that exemplifies a radically different relationship with death and the body: endocannibalism. Not warfare cannibalism, consuming enemies, but consuming one's own relatives. When a member of the community died, their body would be cremated. Later, the ashes and crushed bone fragments would be mixed into a plantain soup and consumed by the family and close community members. Imagine that act. Consciously, deliberately, ingesting the physical remains of someone you loved. The taste, gritty and perhaps mixed with the flavor of the fruit. The texture, the profound, visceral reality of making the deceased a physical part of the living community once more. This practice, while confronting our taboos, held deep meaning for the Yanomami. It wasn't about hunger or aggression. It was about keeping the spirit of the loved one alive and integrated within the community. By consuming the ashes, they believed the individual's spirit continued to live within their relatives, preventing it from wandering lost in the forest or falling into the hands of malevolent spirits. It was an act of profound love and continuity, a way to mourn and remember that ensured the deceased was never truly gone, but became an intrinsic part of the living generation. This practice forces a potent moral reflection. Whose definition of respectful treatment of the dead is the correct one? Does our Western avoidance of the body after death, our embalming and burying or cremating and scattering, truly honor the deceased more than a practice designed to keep them physically and spiritually present within the family unit? It challenges our assumptions about grief, connection, and the fate of the body after the breath leaves it. Now, journey back closer to Europe, to certain cemeteries in medieval and early modern periods. Archaeological excavations have unearthed burials that seem odd, skeletons found with bricks or stones stuffed into their mouths, bodies pinned down with stakes, limbs removed. Why this disturbing treatment of the dead? Because in a world rife with superstition and a lack of understanding about disease and decomposition, sudden death, particularly from epidemic, could be terrifyingly inexplicable. If someone died mysteriously, and then others in their family or village started falling ill, fear could quickly turn to belief that the first person hadn't truly died, but was returning from the grave to prey upon the living, a vampire or similar undead entity. These anti-vampire burials were grim attempts to control the uncontrollable, to use physical means to combat a perceived supernatural threat. A brick in the mouth was meant to prevent the corpse from feeding. Stakes through the body or the removal of limbs were intended to physically immobilize the undead. It's a stark example of symbolic absurdity. Using tangible, physical rituals rooted in folk belief to fight a creature of myth born of fear and misunderstanding. It highlights how historical anxieties about death, disease, and the unknown could manifest in bizarre, desperate practices inflicted upon the bodies of the deceased. It tells us that fear, particularly of what we don't understand, can drive people to treat even the dead with suspicion and violence, reflecting a profound lack of security and control in their world. Let's look at medicine. For centuries in Europe, among supposedly educated circles, there was a strange and rather grim belief that parts of mummified bodies or even fresh human remains held medicinal properties. Mummy brown pigment for artists contained ground-up mummies, but far stranger was the use of powdered human skulls, blood, or fat as remedies for various ailments, from epilepsy to bruises. Kings, queens, and commoners alike ingested these gruesome medicines, believing they could transfer the vitality or spirit of the deceased into the living. Imagine grinding a human skull into powder, the smell, the texture, and then knowingly mixing it into a drink or paste and consuming it, hoping it would cure your illness. This practice, often called medicinal cannibalism, reveals a world operating with a vastly different understanding of the body and health. It wasn't necessarily malicious, but born of a combination of desperation in the face of widespread disease, a belief in sympathetic magic, and the authority of ancient texts and physicians who endorsed such remedies. It also had elements of political irony. Access to genuine mummy, powder, or fresh human remains was often restricted, making these bizarre cures a mark of status for the wealthy who could afford them, while the poor relied on less glamorous folk remedies. It forces us to reflect on how limited knowledge, coupled with unchallenged authority, could lead to the widespread acceptance of practices that seem utterly alien and morally questionable to us today. These examples, consuming ashes, pinning down vampires, ingesting powdered skulls, are diverse, spanning different cultures and time periods. But they share a common thread. They are all attempts to interact with, control, or understand death and the physical body in ways that reflect deep-seated fears, beliefs, and vulnerabilities. They show us societies grappling with mortality, the unknown, and the unsettling transformation that occurs after life ends, sometimes resorting to practices that seem bizarre or horrifying through our modern lens. The debate over the blood eagle fits into this larger historical tapestry. Was it a real act born of extreme vengeance and ritual, or a terrifying story born of fear and misunderstanding? Either way, it, like these other practices, speaks to a human tendency to imbue the body, in life and death, with profound meaning, and to create rituals and narratives around suffering and mortality. Whether through elaborate torture legends, strange burial rites, or bizarre medical practices, history shows us countless ways in which cultures have confronted the limits of the physical body and the inevitability of death, revealing anxieties and beliefs that, while strange, are fundamentally rooted in the shared human experience of being vulnerable, finite beings in a vast, often terrifying world. And as you consider how different cultures have tried to make sense of and exert control over the terrifying reality of death and the body's finality, you might find yourself wondering, how do our modern rituals and beliefs surrounding death and the body reflect our own, perhaps hidden, anxieties, and what does that say about the continuity of human fears across the ages? We've journeyed through grim sagas, silent archaeological sites, and the stark realities of historical state violence and everyday hardship. We've seen the body treated as a weapon, a canvas, a symbol, and a vessel for fear. And throughout this, you, the listener in the relative comfort of the 21st century, have been absorbing these details, perhaps wincing, perhaps morbidly fascinated. Why does this stuff capture us? Why do we seek out the most bizarre, the most brutal, the most unsettling corners of history? It's not just a detached academic interest. There's a pull, a dark curiosity. Perhaps it's the frisson of encountering something utterly alien to our daily lives. Perhaps it's a way of confronting our own anxieties about violence, death, and vulnerability from a safe distance. Or maybe, just maybe, it speaks to something deeper, an uncomfortable acknowledgement of the human capacity for both enduring and inflicting suffering that transcends time and culture. Think about how you encounter historical horror today. It's often mediated through screens, pages in a book, a museum exhibit behind glass. You can pause, close the tab, turn the page. There's a cushion of time, a barrier of technology that separates you from the raw, immediate, overwhelming reality of watching a body broken on a wheel or seeing a village impaled. You get the information, the visual, the concept, but not the smell, the sounds, the pervasive fear that would have been the inescapable reality for those who lived it. You consume the story of the brutality, which is a vastly different experience from living in its shadow. That distance allows for a certain kind of fascination that would be impossible if you were an actual witness. Historically, many of the most brutal punishments were performances, public events. Executions weren't hidden away. They were spectacles held in town squares, designed to be seen. The scaffold, the stocks, the impalement stake, they were stages upon which the power of the state or the justice system was dramatically enacted upon the body of the condemned. This was a deliberate choice. It wasn't enough to simply remove the individual. Their suffering and death had to serve a didactic purpose, a terrifying lesson for the populace. This naked display of power through the control and destruction of the body is a form of political communication that feels profoundly different from modern justice systems, which, while still flawed and capable of inflicting great harm, generally operate outside of the realm of public torture as spectacle. You can visit the Tower of London and see the instruments of torture. You can walk through squares where executions took place centuries ago. These places are often historical sites, tourist attractions. The guillotine is a museum piece. The breaking wheel exists only in illustrations and historical descriptions. The visceral reality is gone, replaced by plaques, interpretive signs, and the low murmur of other visitors. The objects themselves are often cleaned, preserved, presented as artifacts. This sanitization, while necessary for museums, further distances us from the lived horror they represent. The tools of unimaginable suffering become curious objects, stripped of their screams and blood, presented for quiet contemplation or sometimes morbid selfies. It's a peculiar modern performance, turning the sites of past atrocity into destination stories of historical violence, whether confirmed or legendary, can also become tangled up in cultural identity. The fierce Viking image, partly fueled by tales like the blood eagle, becomes a shorthand for strength, independence, even a certain romanticized brutality. National histories often highlight moments of martial prowess or stoic endurance in the face of hardship, sometimes downplaying or omitting less flattering details about internal violence or oppression. The past is curated, selectively remembered to serve present-day narratives. We might recoil from the horror of the blood eagle, but the underlying image of terrifying, unstoppable warriors resonates with certain modern ideas of power or heritage. It raises a cultural blind spot. How much of the history we choose to remember, particularly its violent parts, is filtered through a desire to see ourselves or our ancestors in a particular light. Our bodies today are also canvases, though the inscriptions are different. They are sites of personal identity, political debate, commercial exploitation. We adorn them, modify them, present them on social media, subjecting them to different kinds of scrutiny and judgment than someone facing the stocks or the breaking wheel. But there's a subtle echo. The historical impulse to use the body to communicate, to signify, to control, hasn't entirely vanished. It's just evolved, taking on new forms in a world of screens and selfies, health trends and body shaming, where the pressures are perhaps less physically brutal but can still inflict significant psychological harm. The vulnerability remains, simply expressed in new vocabularies. So, where does this leave us with the blood eagle and the broader landscape of historical brutality? It leaves us with questions about the nature of evidence and the seductive power of a terrifying story, about the vast, often uncomfortable differences in human values across time, about the enduring human capacity for both creating profound beauty and inflicting unimaginable pain. The methods change from stakes and wheels to drone strikes and psychological warfare, but the underlying dynamics of power, control, vengeance and the unfortunate vulnerability of the human body persist. History, in its unflinching gaze, shows us not just how we were different, but in unsettling ways, how we remain the same, still grappling with the same dark potentials. As you step back from these historical shadows, leaving the debated screams of the blood eagle and the certain agony of documented tortures behind, what will you carry forward from this journey into the uncomfortable truths of the past? And how might understanding history's relationship with brutality change how you view the world around you today? We've journeyed through the unsettling landscape of the blood eagle debate, from the vivid, horrifying descriptions in the sagas to the frustrating silence of the archaeological record. We've seen how a story, perhaps more than a historical fact, can seize the imagination and become the face of a culture's perceived brutality. Then, we looked beyond the legend into the documented realities of historical torture. The vertical agony of impalement, the shattering pain of the breaking wheel, the prolonged torment of crucifixion. And from the grand stages of state power, we zoomed into the quieter, but no less pervasive, harshness of everyday life, the constant threat of disease, hunger, and casual violence, and the bizarre, sometimes disturbing ways cultures have grappled with death itself, from consuming kin to burying vampires and drinking powdered skulls. What connects these disparate points in history, these moments of extreme violence, grinding hardship, and strange ritual? It's the enduring human struggle with vulnerability. The body, this fragile, temporary vessel, has always been the site where our deepest fears and our most brutal impulses collide. Fear of death, fear of the unknown, fear of the other, fear of losing control. And in response to these fears, history shows us countless attempts to exert power over enemies, over subjects, over the very mystery of mortality, often through acts that strike directly at the physical being. The impulse to make the body a message, whether through a king's impaled enemy or a community consuming the ashes of a loved one, speaks to a fundamental need to imbue physical existence, even in its final moments, with meaning and control. Standing here, in the relative safety and comfort of the modern world, it's easy to look back and label these historical practices as simply barbaric or primitive. And in many cases, measured against our current values, they absolutely were. But perhaps our fascination, and sometimes our judgment, contains a subtle blindness. We live in a society that often seeks to control the body in different ways, through immense pressure regarding appearance, through the commodification of health and longevity, through the constant surveillance enabled by technology. Our anxieties about physical decay, vulnerability, and death haven't vanished. They've simply shape-shifted, often into less outwardly violent but still pervasive forms of control and anxiety. We may not break people on wheels, but we have our own sophisticated methods of inflicting pain, psychological, social, systemic, that leave invisible scars. The human capacity for cruelty and for crafting elaborate systems around the body's vulnerability remains, dressed in modern clothes. So, did the Vikings perform the blood eagle? Maybe, maybe not. The historical debate, in its uncertainty, is perhaps more telling than a definitive answer. It forces us to confront the limits of our knowledge about the past, the the subjective nature of historical sources, and the unsettling reality that some of the most compelling stories are also the hardest to prove. But regardless of that specific act's historicity, the journey through these grim corners confirms something undeniable. The human story, across time and culture, is one marked by a profound, sometimes terrifying, relationship with the body, with suffering, and with death. It's a relationship that has given rise to acts of shocking cruelty, bizarre rituals, and the relentless, often silent, grind of hardship. The echoes of those historical screams, whispers, and silences linger. They remind us that the past wasn't a gentler, simpler time, but often a harsher, more dangerous, and profoundly strange one. They challenge our assumptions about progress and morality, and force us to consider the darkness that humanity has been, and perhaps always will be, capable of. The fascination isn't just with the gore. It's with the glimpse into minds and worlds so different from our own, yet disturbingly connected by the shared vulnerabilities of the flesh and the enduring struggle against the forces that threaten to break it. The Blood Eagle, real or legendary, opened a door into that difficult history. And the journey through documented tortures, everyday hardships, and bizarre death rituals has shown us that the human capacity for both enduring and inflicting suffering is a constant, unsettling truth. History isn't just about dates and kings. It's about bodies and beliefs, vulnerability and power, etched in blood and bone, story and silence. It's a reminder that while we may recoil, understanding these darker corners helps illuminate the full, complex, and often uncomfortable spectrum of the human experience. We've ventured deep into history's capacity for cruelty tonight. First, into the confined, decaying space of Scaphism, a punishment designed to strip away dignity and life through the most intimate biological horror. Turning the body against itself, it leaves a lingering, visceral unease, a chilling testament to the invention of suffering. Then we grappled with the Blood Eagle, a legend perhaps as much as reality, but one that speaks volumes about vengeance, power, and using the body as a canvas for terrifying messages. Whether fact or chilling fiction, it highlights a human fascination with transforming enemies into symbols of their own destruction. Both stories, in their grim inventiveness or debated reality, reveal something unsettling about humanity's capacity not just for violence, but for crafting suffering, for pushing boundaries in the name of power, justice, or fear. They show us how the body has always been a site of vulnerability, and how societies have projected their deepest anxieties onto flesh and bone. Understanding these darker corners helps illuminate the full, complex spectrum of the human experience. The parts we'd rather forget. If you found yourself leaning in tonight, despite the discomfort, consider liking this video and subscribing for more journeys into history's strange and unsettling depths. And let us know in the comments below, what other uncomfortable truth about the past do you think we should explore? The echoes of these historical screams and whispers linger, a reminder that history is rarely clean, often brutal, and always, always stranger and more fascinating than you think. Until our next dive into the shadows, stay curious.